In 1953, the average South Korean was earning $67 per year. That is about $5 a month. In 1953, South Korea was so destroyed because of the war that the World Bank considered it as having no realistic path of bouncing back from the total destruction that the war caused. In 1953, South Korea was surviving solely on American aid as everything was destroyed. There was no functioning banking system and no infrastructure. The situation was so severe that farming on damaged war-scarred land made up 45% of what little economy remained. Every professional economist was so sure that there is no recovering from this. But unbeknownst to the world, South Korea was about to accomplish what will go down in history as the greatest economic revolution of all time. It is impossible to understand and fully appreciate what South Korea did without a historical background. So it is 1945, and Japan just surrendered and gave up its colonies. One of those colonies was Korea. Here is where it got split between the USSR and the US. One got the south and the other got the north. The thing about South Korea is that it had no heavy industry at the time, no real banking system, and widespread poverty. The south was primarily agricultural land. But in the first time in 35 years, the people finally got their own country, and they were trying to build something out of it. But this did not please everybody. In June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and the newly formed Communist China, invaded the south, marking the beginning of one of the most destructive wars of the 20th century. During the 3 years of the war, Seoul, the capital, changed hands 4 times, and in each time, it was bombed and burned. Every other big city was heavily damaged, and almost every existing infrastructure was reduced to rubble. Over 3 million deaths on both sides, 5 to 10 million were displaced or made refugees, and almost 20 million people lost at least one close family member. Nothing and nobody was left untouched from the war. And to make matter even worse, the end of the war did not mean that South Koreans will get to rest. The amount of destruction the war brought was so severe that even when the war ended, millions were projected to die of famine or non-existent healthcare. As we established, South Korea was solely surviving on American aid. The country at the time was poorer than Ghana, Sudan, and many other sub-Saharan countries. The entirety of the GDP was $1.5 billion. When you take all of this into consideration, you can understand why the World Bank refused to give South Korea a loan and deemed it as a hopeless case and a permanent aid receiver. The years following the end of the war were just about survival, not development. The American aid financed basic reconstruction, like roads and schools. The government at the time had no strategy to pump up the economy. The GDP per capita did not see much of a change, as it went from $67 post the Korean War to $79 in 1960. Barely any movement in 7 years. That was until Park Chung-hee launched a military coup and seized control of the government on May 1961. Even though Park was a dictator, he was not like the typical dictators that we all know. Was he ruthless? Yes, but he was all about carrying out the economy. In his second year in power, Park launched the first 5-year economic plan. He was not asking for change, he was demanding it. The 5-year plan consisted of hard operational blueprints with specific targets, deadlines, and real consequences. Every government ministry, every major corporations, all of them answering to the same plan. And the way Park kept companies in line was genius. If you hit your export targets, you got access to cheap government credit, subsidized energy, and protection from foreign competition. And if they missed those targets, they get cut off. Park even held monthly meetings himself, sitting across from company executives and going through their numbers one by one. But here is where it gets a little insane. To modernize the economy, Park assigned specific tasks to large companies in different sectors. He removed every bureaucratic obstacle for them, gave them everything they needed, and in return, they have to fulfill their assigned tasks. The problem is that he demands something from a company that has nothing to do with their demand. For example, you know Samsung, right? They were a trading in food company until Park came and demanded a whole semiconductor. And Hyundai too was in construction until Park demanded that they make a whole shipyard. His methods seem to be unrealistic, but to be fair, he did help them with anything. It was just that he was punching a gun on their head in case they failed. And it did work, so nobody can complain really. Things were going smoothly until Park was assassinated on October 26, 1979, by the head of his own Central Intelligence Agency. About a month later, Major General Shan Do-hwan launched a coup within the military, seizing control of the armed forces in the state. On top of the political crisis, South Korea also encountered another economic crisis, the second global oil shock of 1979. South Korea was one of the countries that got hit real hard by this event, as they import almost all of their energy. Inflation peaked at a whopping 30%, and the GDP growth hit an all-time low with a negative 1.5%. Keep in mind that even though the economy was rapidly developing, it was nowhere near as strong as it should be to fully absorb this shock. But while the US took 4 years to recover, and it took the UK nearly a decade, it only took 2 years for South Korea to fully recover from the shock. The GDP growth got right back at 7%, and inflation was at the single digits by 1982. Things quickly picked up speed again, and by 1996, the first economic miracle was complete. South Korea, after 34 years of continuous growth, finally became officially recognized as a developed country. In 34 years, South Korea went from $100 GDP per capita to a staggering $12,000. That is nearly a 12,000% increase in one generation. South Korea will go to be one of the fastest recovering economies from crises that hit the whole world, like the 1997 Asian financial crisis, where the Korean currency lost 50% of its value and the unemployment hit an all-time high 7%. But South Korea was able to pull off another miracle and recovered from that in just 18 months and paid the $58 billion bailout loan 3 years ahead of schedule. South Koreans even donated their own gold to help pay the loan, raising approximately $2.5 billion. Also, in the 2008 crisis, South Korea avoided the recession entirely and stayed at 0.7% growth. Even when the won lost 40% of its value against the dollar, South Korea was considered the best performing advanced economy in the OECD during the crisis, and they recovered from all of this in just 1 year. And again, in the MERS outbreak in 2015, South Korea recovered in just 6 months. And in COVID, when advanced economies lost nearly 10% of their output, South Korea barely lost 1%, and it got to recover in just under a year. At this point, it was clear South Korea built a system that acts like a shock absorber, giving them the benefit of recovering faster than any other economy on earth. But there is still some pain and suffering that should be acknowledged alongside the achievement. Park's regime was a military dictatorship, meaning that everyone who opposed him was either imprisoned or executed. Labor unions were brutally suppressed, and many factory workers and young women worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. Even when the economic miracle had its success, the work culture never changed. South Korea consistently ranks among the longest working nations in the world. The average worker clocks in up to 2,000 hours a year. Young people too are one of the most academically pressured students in the world. The work culture there is so extreme that the youth had given up on marriage and having children. The same values that willed the miracle, sacrifice, collective duty, relentless work, never really got switched off when the emergency was over. South Korea built a first world economy and then kept it running like a country still fighting for survival. And now, a generation of young Koreans is paying the price for that. And yet, despite all of this, when you look at where South Korea started and where it stands today, it is impossible not to be astonished by what this country pulled off. This was the story of how South Korea proved the entirety of the world wrong by accomplishing the greatest economic comeback in human history, and kept proving itself crisis after crisis